Good morning, everyone. I'm Orson Mason. I'm a member of North United Methodist Church Care and Nurture team. And over the last couple of years, we've done a number of recordings dealing with COVID and also dealing with mental health perspectives about COVID. And this is our latest endeavor at expanding that conversation. One thing I want you to know that our previous recordings you can find those on our church website, North United Methodist Church website, and you'll be able to play those and that'll connect this in a way for any of you who may have missed any of our earlier recordings or those who want to get a refresh about that. So let me just go straight in. Pastor Diane is going to close us with some comments and a prayer. But the main chunk, if you will, of our conversation is going to be led by Dick Collins, a licensed clinical social worker who has helped us in these discussions in the past. He has, I always chuckle when I say this, decades. That's a wonderful blessing to be able to provide decades of counseling, whether it's in private practice, whether it's in a large healthcare setting. Dick has experience with individuals, whether it's substance abuse or whether it's suicide thoughts, overwhelming senses of overwhelming anxiety, a wide range in the space of mental health. And so he's going to give us his thoughts about these kinds of things. Now, granted, just to set this up, we recognize that the data shows that instances of COVID have been waning a bit. And in fact, you'll notice that in our church, for those of you who are church members. But still, we think it's important to reflect on and have some fresh thoughts about how does this period of time with COVID and as well as some other issues that are going on in the community, how can they impact us? So without further ado, let me just pull Dick right on into this and begin with our sort of questions. You ready, Dick?
I'm ready.
All right, we got a little sound check there. That's good. It's reported that the spread of COVID has significantly challenged and impacted, in particular, care providers, church leaders, and even lay caregivers providing support for people with COVID or the families or deep friends of people who have COVID. What can we do to ease the negative impact of these stressors on service and care providers?
I'm really glad you asked that question, right? Because so often all of our attention is on those of us who are suffering and not those who are taking care of those of us who are suffering. I'll tell you, after decades of caregiving myself and being around other caregivers, that a common theme of caregivers is that they have a notoriously bad track record of taking care of ourselves. We might think the opposite, right? That somebody's in a caretaking position, they're probably really good at their own self-care. In fact, the opposite tends to be true, that caregivers oftentimes are in denial of their own needs and stress levels because they're so busy taking care of others. So one of the first things we could do is just recognize that simple fact, right? That the caregivers around us, be they professional or lay professional or just other family members that are pitching in, that right, or the family members are always the caregivers in the family, are likely denying and avoiding being in touch with and taking care of their own needs. So one of the most important things that we could do after recognizing that is just simple acts of loving kindness towards them. Ask them how they're doing. Take a moment and in while they're engaged in their role of caretaking you and your family, ask them how they're doing and what's going on with them. I've done that with professional doctors that I see. We start our session and I say, hey, before we get going, how are you? And it always takes them aback, as if, that's a very unusual thing for them to hear. But they're always you can tell, very appreciative that just a client or a patient took the time to ask them simply how they were doing. The second question I think that we can ask the caregivers around us is, what do you need? Is there anything I can do for you? Right? Hey, I'm aware that, boy, you've been taking great care of me and my family, et cetera. But you may need some things. Is there anything that we can do for you? So just those simple acts of kindness coming back, I think likely, since it is common for caretakers to be in denial of their own needs, that simple question back to them can be a very powerful reminder for them as caregivers that they need to self-care.
I think that's really good counsel, and it dovetails with something that our church was doing with spiritual practices for Lent. And one of them was, and the list was pray for and with others each week. And so if you tie these acts together of engaging with care providers, whether it's professional or lay, and you add the prayer component to it, this can be a powerful way to help individuals.
Right, I agree.
So let me go on to our second question. While the spread of the virus has declined, as I mentioned, there are remaining concerns for non-vaccinated people and children. It just seems bewildering. How do I manage all of this mountain of data and reports while keeping my sanity?
Right. Great question. Because part of the problem, right, is our anxiety leads us to want to look at more data, find the definitive data, right?
Yes.
And the problem with that is the data that's out there sometimes can sound contradictory. You could hear advice on the same topic go two different ways if you change your TV channel, right?
Yeah.
And so some of the issue, what I would recommend people do is, am I looking for more information so that I can simply begin to relax or feel more comfortable, right? So the first thing to recognize is more information is not automatically helpful in terms of lowering the stress I feel about decisions about taking care of myself and my family around COVID. Second bit of advice, I think, is just to keep it simple. By this point in the game, we know how to take precautions, and we already know all the information about action steps that we can take that are simply reasonable, right? In terms of mask wearing, hand washing, boosters, whatever. And I think that the notion is we don't need more information. We just need to honor the information that we already have. And part of that information source is, if I'm uncomfortable, even though the data may say that it's fine to go out into your grocery store or public events and not wear a mask, if I am personally uncomfortable with that or feel vulnerable, I need to honor that as a form of self-care. So while the data may say it's perfectly okay for me to go to a sporting event or to the grocery store and not mask up, if my gut tells me I'm uncomfortable with that, go ahead, just simply go ahead and wear a mask. So we can trust. I'm always in favor of trusting what our bodies are telling us we're comfortable with more than what the TV is telling us we should be comfortable with.
And to add to that is to feel empowered to share your position with those in your circle.
Yeah.
So if you're going to the grocery store with someone else, it's okay to say to them that you're going to mask and not ask them to mask.
Right.
Because you have to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So
Mhm.
thank you for that. That's important. That empowerment sense of self-care
Well,
is so
and
important.
so it could, you know, people are families are feeling more comfortable now in gathering in groups, you know, birthdays, anniversaries, you know, all these things that we used to do before COVID, and assuming, right, because the TV or the data tell us it's fine, that's fine. And so we may have to have sometimes, to your point, Orson, difficult conversations even with our own family members at family gatherings, about, hey, I'm coming, but just so you know, I'm going to be masked. I'm going to wear a mask, and yeah, whatever precautions I feel I need to take, even within my own family, and feel comfortable in having those conversations, again, to honor what would help us feel most comfortable in those settings.
Right, right. In addition to the COVID issues that we are facing, there's been another big boy, big girl event that has shown up, and that is the war, the European war that is raging uh, right now. So, adding to concerns, the reports are so disturbing. So many visual scenes of battles, destruction, war victims on television, as well as whether you watch it on the computer or your tablet or whatnot. There are also the audio reports of it coming over the radio. And if you put all of that together, you can be in constant mode of being just swarmed with all this information. Can this exposure negatively impact my mental health? The
Well,
reporting seems all day long.
right. It's not a question of can it. It definitely does. I've used the analogy in the past that, you know, with COVID, right, we take precautions not to expose ourselves to situations where, you know, the rate of infection probability is higher. I think people, again, maybe out of their anxiety or concern, or, you know, expose themselves to too much information during these times. And let's face it, it's not just the war, right? This war in Ukraine has come at the end of a 2-year period. If we just think back what we've lived through in the past 2.5 years, um, it's like we've been exposed for an entire 2.5 or a longer year period of being bombarded with threatening information, whether that is threatening in a political sense or a health sense, economic sense. We've just been bombarded with that. So we should expect ourselves in general, right, to have our flight or fight response or stress response elevated anyway, just from what we've been through in the past 2 years. Now, this war situation comes in, and it's just another example or another series element in the series of things that we've all lived through that threatens to just push that stress response button in us, right? Um, so then how do we, because all these presentations have been about, given COVID and everything else that's going on, how do we self-care? One, the simplest way that we can self-care, especially now with this Ukraine situation, is be conscious of the need to limit ourselves to the exposure of just watching it and reading about it, right? Uh, because we in general, we've been, our stress responses have been elevated anyway. So less is more. It's important to keep informed, but pay attention to when we've crossed that threshold and it begins to feel like we're simply overexposed.
There's another group that, in terms of self care and caring for others, Dick is a veteran and so am I. And so, for some of us who have been involved in the military and during periods of war and conflict, This can be a tripwire for some of those individuals. There's someone in your family member, it's when you're checking on them, when you're praying for them, it's okay to reach out. You don't have to be an expert for this. If you see them watching too much, what you might think might be questionable amount of news consumption about the war, the VA is a very good institution. The church is a very good organization, and mental health practitioners. So for yourself and for those folks, it's okay to make referrals. It's an important thing.
And keep in mind that, again, part of how our anxiety works as human beings is we look for ways to alleviate that experience of it. And it is quite common and natural as one way of trying to alleviate that is simply to get more and more information, right? As if more information will help me feel better or calmer and more at peace. And so an act of loving kindness, as you say, Orson, especially as the war in Ukraine triggers very specific populations, is just to help remind them that self-care may entail exposing themselves to less instead of more.
Yeah, yeah. And Indianapolis and the counties neighboring us has also continued over the last 3 years. I think it's 3 years, maybe it's even 4, but increases in violence in our community. Whether it's gun violence, domestic violence, these episodes remain a disturbing aspect of our community. Can these reports stress us from a mental health perspective? There's so much going on, so many changes. How does a person cope?
Well, there again, right? I think if one sees one's reaction to these reports that are coming in, because certainly I think exactly because of COVID, people's stress response and vulnerabilities have shown itself in this whole thing that we're talking about with the increase in violence, domestic violence, and street violence, et cetera. But the important thing is, well, this is, again, from the standpoint of us as human beings, this is one more data point, right? Not only do I turn on my TV and I hear conflicting COVID data about how to self-care. I see the war in Ukraine. I see, political issues going on. I see higher reports of violence and domestic violence and overdoses and so forth. Just take that as another example of me needing to be, on the one hand, sensitive to it and take common sense precaution. But on the other hand, this is one more thing that is a part of this whole umbrella of stress challenge that we've been living through in the last 2 years, that really create an elevated challenge for ourselves to monitor our well-being and take care of ourselves in very intentional ways. Self-care does not happen randomly. It happens as an act of everyday intention of going about asking oneself, geez, if I notice this exposure to TV and violence is up and so forth, what am I needing right now and how do I need to take care of myself? Do I need to change channels away from that? Do I need to recognize my own response, but then just see it as one more thing that's pressing that button, that stress response button in me that seems like it's been on the on mode for 2.5 years now.
Yeah, that's important. And this impacts, as I mentioned earlier, about specific communities. We talked about veterans, but we don't want to forget our youth. And whether they're in the church or in the community, our young members of our communities are witnessing and a part of all of this just being washed over and over and over with all this news and information. And so we need to take care of ourselves so we can take care, whether it's the veterans or it's the elderly or the youth. And ways to do that are to, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first. You really can't help others if your own self-care practices are faulty, broken, and just not able to sustain you. Let me go into another one that's a little different. We've talked about in terms of this violence and illness, but financial. The challenge is now inflation makes my family and home budgeting not a challenge. Man, I'll say it's a problem for some folks. A lot of people, higher gas prices, transportation costs, healthcare costs, groceries cost. Any thoughts on, is there something different I need to do in terms of managing that self-care? What are your thoughts?
Well, let's one important thing to keep in mind is when we are anxious, or that, to put it another way, that stress response is triggered by anything, right? What we tend to do as human beings is not tend to be more flexible in our thinking and adapting, right? We become more rigid. So we tend to double down on what we always do. There's an old expression from AA, and that is, if I always do what I've always done, I'll always get what I always got, you know. And that's just another way of recognizing that, and we'll apply it to our finances here in a second, that when I'm stressed, I pretty much default to whatever my normal coping mechanism is, right? But especially when it comes to our finances, right, that might not be the best way, often is not the best way of managing our money more efficiently and wisely. So just recognizing that tendency when I'm scared about money may be the very time when I just don't do anything at all about how I change how I spend it, look at it, consider it. You know, I may spend a lot of time, if I'm really anxious about my budget, not even avoiding it altogether, thinking about it altogether. That stress response of avoidance, I just don't want to even look at my bills, right, this week because they're just too overwhelming. So that avoidance, when it comes to our finances, is a huge factor in terms of one thing that will actually make the problem worse, right? If money's tight and I avoid really allowing myself time to sit down and take a look at that in a creative way, then I'm likely to sustain patterns in my spending that actually create more financial problems, more stress, and then more avoidance, right? So I'm caught in that trap financially that anxiety and hence avoidance creates. So it's just recognizing that out loud and allowing ourselves to normalize that anxiety that we feel around our finances and our budgets, then may create a little bit of a space to say, okay, now that I've recognized my tendency to want to avoid taking a look at my money and my money situation, let me take a breath, carve out a time with intention to sit down and just catch my breath a little bit and go over where my finances are and approach it in a more thoughtful way. In that way, we may see all kinds of opportunities to make adjustments, slight adjustments here or there that will save money. For example, when we're stressed, we tend to spend more money on things to take away the stress. Food, that probably is food and alcohol expenses, lottery tickets, right? I mean, some of these more compulsive or addictive patterns can emerge around our financial situation because we're already stressed about this other stuff, right? So we could make financial choices specifically in a way that fosters unhealthy coping, right?
Mhm.
So just recognizing where can I cut back in ways that I may be spending money in a way that's really more anxiety based, trying to get comfort through the expenditure of what little money I have on things that I don't actually need or that would help me feel genuinely more comfortable.
Yeah, thank you. That's it's we don't hear about that techniques about helping on financial planning. When we really think about it, it ties in with physical care, self mental health care,
Mhm.
financial care, and caring for others. All of these things in combination. Then tie a ribbon of spirituality with it, and your faith walk. And we think that these are going to be some good ways to get through this. So I want to thank you, Dick, for your wise and helpful insights. Your ideas and methods to extend our mental health wellness and balance practices, we very much appreciate it. Did you have any closing remarks for the group before we move on?
Well, I'll tell you a little simple. When we're stressed, one of the first things that gets affected is simply our breathing. Now, I'll tie this into a prayer element, an idea that I thought of this morning. Um, I thought about saying the Lord's Prayer, and I did this for myself. Um, but to be able to say the Lord's Prayer in conjunction with an intentional breathing exercise, our Father, and then breathe all the way out and down, and let our breath go all the way to the bottom. Take a slow in breath in, who art in heaven, all the way down, and go through the entire Lord's Prayer. Tie that in with some intentional breathing with each of those phrases, right? That we normally pause anyway
Right.
in saying the Lord's Prayer. And that'll take about a minute, but just that minute of intentional breathing while we're praying will help literally lower our stress response very significantly.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you. Glad we got that nugget in, because I think that's a very nice way to think about it. So I want to mention about the Easter holidays because it's right around the corner and it's a time of appreciation, a time of gathering, reflection, remembering, and we recognize that it also can be a time to experience thoughts of change, loss, and isolation. And so it's quite normal that we can be in a almost celebratory uh, Easter season, and at the same time, we can remember those who are no longer with us, who may have been with us last year or in previous years. This is quite common. And so if you feel the need to talk to someone or reach out, uh, do so. Take action on it. You're not an interruption to those who care about you. You're not an interruption for our church. And for those of you who are seeing us on YouTube, whatever your faith tradition is, I can almost guarantee to you that you will not be an interruption. So feel empowered to reach out because it is very common to be both thankful and have a sense of loneliness during holiday seasons, Easter included. All right. Oh, one other thing we didn't mention so much that happens in holidays, and that's this notion about ideation on suicide and self-harm. And I do want to take a moment to encourage any of our viewers who may themselves be thinking about self-harm, or they know someone who has verbalized self-harm or written it to you in some way, get help in those areas, whether it's for you or someone else. But get some professional help. Don't delay. Don't try to judge it. Don't gauge it. Is this more serious or less? Don't do any of that. Plug into a care provider who can help you help that person if it's someone else, but to work through these moments of ideation because we see this during holidays. The church has a role. Dick, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just one. The primary thing, the care and concern for others, when somebody is contemplating self-harm, the one thing that we could be mindful of is an increased tendency to withdraw and isolate. That is unusual in our experience with them. So, piggybacking on top of what you said, if we know somebody that we have some concerns about, and we're noticing them through this holiday withdrawing even more, that is a signal to definitely reach out to them and care for them a little bit.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Diane, would you give us some thoughts that you have and then lead us into a prayer? And then we'll let that prayer be the conclusion of this segment of our exploration into self-care and mental health.
Thank you. I can't stress enough the importance of self-care. I would encourage people not to view self-care as a selfish act. Rather, it's a selfless act and will just help to maintain better health and well-being for you and really allow you to give better care to others as well that might be needed. Be kind to yourselves. The pandemic and other events over the last few years have been difficult and stressful for all of us. So please be kind to yourself. Let yourself grieve what has happened. Acknowledge those fears, the anger that may have accompanied all of these events in the last couple of years. Our pastoral staff at North is always just a phone call away and ready to talk with you and support you. However, if the feelings that you are having might be overwhelming, as Dick and Orson have talked about, please contact professional help. Our pastoral staff will be happy to help you do that as well. Let's pray. Dear God, who is with us at all times, even when we feel that you may not be near, there's a part of us that hopefully can acknowledge that you are with us, that you walk with us, that you'll hold our hands when we're hurting. You'll provide guidance to us when we need to discern important events in our life. When we need to seek care, please lead us to that. In your Holy Son's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.